Good afternoon. I'm Neil Quilliam. I'm an associate fellow with the Middle East North Africa program at Chatham House, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's MENA webinar, Israel-Palestine, the implications for Jordan. Really looking forward to a good discussion. We were just saying that it's quite rare or not very often that we actually host events on Jordan. So I'm really pleased that we can do that today. I'm joined by three excellent speakers who I'll briefly introduce at the moment, but just to sort of set a little bit of context, I was thinking today how so many of us think about Jordan. Jordan's like a sort of a favorite auntie or a favorite uncle that we always sort of look out for. We worry about their welfare, and somebody that we feel great affection with and for. Jordan has been, I've been going back and forth to Jordan for many years, and Jordan's sort of constantly subject to external shocks. We could list them forever, but I sort of think of 1990, 91, 2003, the Syrian war, and now this cycle of violence in Gaza. Jordan's always seems to be sort of, getting back onto its feet, and then there's an external shock that sort of, gives a country a very significant challenge. And at the same time, there's always this kind of prevailing logic, as I see it at least, that Jordan will sort of muddle through. Jordan sort of on the brink, but not not quite there. And I think that's something we want to look at today, because the region is changing. The region has changed quite significantly over the past decade, but the last 4 or 5 years specifically. And with the level of violence that we're seeing in Gaza at the moment, and with activities or unrest and violence in the West Bank, it does look to have a much larger impact on Jordan than perhaps some observers from the side might think about. And that's just to sort of set the context. This afternoon, I'm joined by three excellent speakers. I'm really pleased to have them with us. We have Nasser Khaliji, who's a critically acclaimed award-winning film and music producer and photographer. He's produced many local and international musicians who've risen to worldwide acclaim and generated tens of millions of views on different streaming platforms. He was also head of production of the Stratcoms unit in the Jordanian army, a unit designed to combat extremist narratives in Jordan and regionally. We've also got Dr. Curtis Ryan, who joined the Department of Government and Justice Studies at Appalachian State University in 2003. Professor Ryan served as a Fulbright Scholar, I'm not going to give the dates, at the Center for Strategic Studies at the University of Jordan in Jordan, and was twice named a Peace Scholar by the United States Institute of Peace. He's written 3 books: Jordan in Transition, From Hussein to Abdullah, Inter-Arab Alliances, Regime Security and Jordanian Foreign Policy, and Jordan and the Arab Uprisings, Regime Survival and Politics Beyond the State, which he presented to us back in 2018, 2019. And then finally, we're joined by Rana Swais, who is the founder and managing director of Wishbox Media, a company that provides media training, research services, and creative storytelling packages. She's a freelance journalist and media researcher. Her work has been published in the New York Times, Prospect Magazine, Huffington Post, and other media outlets. Her book, Voices of Jordan, provides a compelling collage of contemporary Jordanian narratives, and she presented her book at Chatham House a few years back. So we have a great sort of lineup today. Just to state that our meeting today is on the record and it is currently being recorded. If you wish to sort of tweet about us, please use at Chatham House or at ch_MENA, please. We're going to start with sort of 5 to 6 minutes each from our 3 speakers, and then we're going to sort of have a conversation, have a discussion, and then open up for broader questions. I understand there are about 500 people joining us this afternoon, so hopefully we're going to have a lot of good, challenging, engaging questions and have a great discussion on the subject. If I could actually start with you, Rana, and ask you to sort of open up the conversation, please. I believe you're going to talk about the implications of the war on Jordan, and I'll hand over to you now. Thank you. I think you might be on mute.
Thank you so much, Neil, and it's great to be with you all. As you mentioned, Neil, the ongoing conflict in Gaza has far-reaching implications, I think, mainly for the Levant area, but significantly, it has impacted and continues to impact Jordan economically, politically, and socially, probably along with Egypt more than any other country in the region. Primarily, I'd like to discuss how the war in Gaza affected Jordan, focusing mainly on the economic strain and political tensions and also security concerns vis-a-vis the West Bank as well. If I can briefly talk about the impact it has had, the war on Gaza has had on the economy in Jordan. As you know, the war in Gaza has had substantial impact in terms of the economy. Just as an example, in regards to tourism, nearly 80% of tourists intending to visit Jordan have canceled their bookings for the upcoming season, I would say from March to May, while foreign inflows are expected to continue. The private sector investment sentiment in Jordan may and continues to weaken if the war continues to persist. The war also and the economic strain is further exacerbated by the already high unemployment rates we have in Jordan even before the war. Currently, the national unemployment rate is over 21%, and a staggering 46.1% among youth. And it's important to note that the average age of a Jordanian is 24 years old. So in that regards, it's been it's just, I would say, exacerbated the unemployment problem, but also in regards to tourism and investment, the ongoing conflict, and also that just the regional instability also have deterred foreign investment in Jordan. Investors perceive Jordan today at high risk, and this decline in investment has already slowed down economic projects and development initiatives. And this, of course, has long-term economic impact as well, and declining employment opportunities. But also, it's important to note there's an enormous boycott also in Jordan against Israeli, but mostly American and other foreign goods. And this has had a significant impact on Jordan's economy and job market as well. The boycott has led to a 15% decline in imports from Israel and affected various sectors reliant on foreign goods as well. I would say the agricultural sector also faces the productivity challenges, while other sectors are experiencing disruptions. And I will let Nasser talk more about this. I know he's interested in this aspect. But the boycott has resulted in also substantial job losses. Approximately, according to the government, 15,000 jobs are at risk because of the boycott, because these sectors like the restaurant, food, and beverage industries, they rely heavily on American and foreign companies. So as a result, however, local businesses have seen or reported increased sales. But as I already mentioned, the economic challenges are immense, and it's just not enough. And I would say, if I can just talk briefly about the West Bank and Israel's annexation and spillover. or fears of spillover. Since October 7th, over 500 Palestinians have been killed in the West Bank, and more than 4,950 have been injured, with 800 settler attacks against Palestinians, according to the UN. So this conflict has raised extreme security concerns in Jordan, including a potential spillover violence and increased militant activity as well. I know Curtis will talk about protests in Jordan as well, so I will leave that part to him. The war has also intensified diplomatic pressure on Jordan to take a stronger stance against Israel, with public opinion, of course, urging the government to expel Israeli diplomats and reconsider the peace treaty as well. According to a UN human rights report, current Israeli policies align with the settler movement's goal to expand and control the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and integrate it into Israel. As you can imagine, Israel's annexation plans and settler expansions threaten the security of Jordan, including the internal security of Jordan and cooperation between Jordan and Israel. I would say this, the foreign minister of Jordan has been very vocal against Israeli policies, especially in the West Bank, but of course also the war on Gaza. And the attempt by the right-wing government in Israel to expel Palestinians from the West Bank in Jordan has been called by the King of Jordan as a declaration of war. I think the more subtle aspects of what we're seeing and the impact of the Gaza war on Jordan, finally, is the immense challenge for the US and Europe's reputation and soft power, I think. And this is not talked about enough. You know how these things take years to build and a day to destroy. And I think it's definitely a challenge. We have a generation in Jordan growing up who view today the US government as complicit in the killing of women and children in Gaza, and a country and a leader in Israel that no one is able to stop. So I think, however, that being said, I think Jordanians generally have also been impacted by the protest movements in the US and other places, including US university campuses. But I think in terms of democracy, human rights, values, perceptions, credibility, and reputation, these things have been battered and bruised. And I'm not sure, to be honest, if it's a permanent shift, or what will happen if there's a ceasefire. What happens during the US elections? I mean, the results of the US elections, and I would also even say in Europe as well. I don't really have answers right now, or maybe it's too early, but something has shifted for sure in terms of all of these values that we have grown up on, and how this new generation views it. So I'll stop there, Neil. I hope it wasn't too much information, but I tried to cover just what I have been seeing and sort of reading and trying to get a feel of from Jordan.
Thank you, Rana. No, that was perfect. I mean, I think you touched on some very, very important subjects there and matters there. And I think what's probably very important for our audience is especially if you're sat outside, you can't really get a sense of what it's like inside the country. So I think you've touched on that really, really well. And there are some points I would like to come back to in this discussion. I mean, it's interesting that it does feel like we're at a big moment, and there's this big shift. And your point about reputation, I was thinking that earlier today when you sort of suggested what you're going to talk about, because I remember back, aging myself, but I remember back in sort of 2003, I was living in Jordan at the time, and the war in Iraq was being prosecuted. And I was then younger generation, and my younger generation peers that I lived and worked with had the same sense that, that the credibility of human rights, of democracy was under threat, under challenge. And I'm really interested to sort of see if that's really shifted or changed, or whether that shift is permanent. But maybe we can come back to that in the discussion. Nasser, if I can come to you, please, and let's have your 5 to 7 minutes. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Really excellent points raised there by Rana. I just also want to add on the economic strain front, the Houthi blockade of the Red Sea has also had a huge impact on us, because we import a lot of our basic needs and a lot of items that go into manufacturing and whatnot. And the price of shipping from the Far East specifically, at one point it was 7 times as much. And this is creating many problems in terms of the cost of production, in terms of the cost of basic goods in the market, and also in the cycle of production, because people are getting their needs much delayed than needed. Going back to what Neil was saying about, the last 30 years for Jordan has been, on the brink continuously, starting with the first Iraq war, then the second Iraq war, and then the war in Lebanon, and then the Arab Spring, and the war in Syria, and this latest round of Israeli aggression against Gazans. But I also think what is different today is that Jordanians feel that this is an existential threat. And what many Jordanians are saying is that we should absolutely listen to Israeli leaders. They mean what they say. When you have far right-wing extremists in government saying that we will annex the West Bank, we will come for Jordan after, Jordanians today believe them. Before most Jordanians took it as rhetoric, as something that's far-fetched, something that will happen maybe decades down the line. But today, you ask most Jordanians, they are really taking this seriously. And this sort of existential threat is worrying, because what would happen to us? Like His Majesty declared the annexation of the West Bank as it would be a declaration of war. Are we ready to go to war with America and Israel? What options do we have? Can we close our borders to the Palestinians if they are being expelled from their home? That's not the Jordanian way, obviously. And on a humanitarian level, we will obviously have to let them in. And what implications would that have to Jordan's future and demographic makeup and the political challenges? God only knows what will happen there. Also, I think one of the aspects that people are not talking about is the mental health of Jordanians. Jordan is very different than other Arab countries, simply because of our proximity to occupied Palestine and Israel, and also our makeup. Today, there is a huge number of Jordanians from Palestinian backgrounds, and they are seeing their own cousins and their own villages and their own families being slaughtered and massacred and prosecuted and burned and tortured and in some cases raped. So I think this puts Jordan in a totally different category to the rest of the Arab world, simply because of its makeup. And of course, the other components of the Jordanian society have a long history of confrontation with Israel. And you can barely find a household here that doesn't have people in the military who fought in previous wars. And on a basic humanitarian level, people today, like, the frustration with the West is, this is not a gray matter to not be very clear on. It's a black and white issue. You do not bomb hospitals. You do not bomb refugee camps. You do not bomb schools. You do not slaughter tens of thousands of women and children and defenseless men in this manner. And in the long term, I agree with Rana. It's an existential crisis also in terms of, what do you want? I mean, is the democracy that we have been trying to strive for since our inception? And also a very worrying thing for Jordan is the rise of the far right wing in Europe, Trump's re-election it's looking like an increasing possibility. And of course, in Israel, we know that the people running the show are far right-winged. And also what we learned during this war is that the Israeli society is much more radicalized and extreme than previously thought. We always had thought that there will be reasonable voices there, because a lot of Jordanians do read for Israeli writers, Israeli or Jewish, like Norbert Finkelstein, Chomsky. They're huge figures within the intellectual community here in Jordan. So we had thought that, they were the representation in Israeli society was much larger, but unfortunately, as polls say, as the social media, the government media, the government ministers, what they declare, we are asking ourselves, like, there's no way we can survive if this entity remains in place. We honestly feel like maybe Europeans neighboring Nazi Germany in Second World War. So the future is very uncertain. I think most Jordanians are really worried about the existence of Jordan. And add to that we are isolated on the diplomatic and political level because the Gulf obviously has, aspirations to how the region would look like in the future. And the least of their concern is the Palestinian people, of course, and of course Jordan. Jordan doesn't fit in that narrative. So, Rana referenced the increasing pressure on the government here to cut ties with Israel. But as a backup, what's the alternative? Syria is in ruins, Lebanon is in ruins. Iraq is not really in a place to really help out. And we rely on Israel for water, which is really worrying Jordanians now because, like maybe ethically, we would want our government to take stronger stances against the Israelis, but we are also being held hostage, particularly when it comes to the water issue. And to add to Rana's point about how we feel about the West, today many restaurants in Jordan put up signs that if you are not pro-Palestinian, you're not welcome here. Many places in Jordan are refusing basically to serve any Americans in specific, because in the Jordanian mind today, there's no difference between America and Israel. Of course, they're paying attention to the protest movements in universities. A lot of brave folks in the US have been speaking out, whether they're from the Black community or the minorities, or even some Jewish voices and some academics and whatnot. But in general, the politicians in America are just as extreme as their counterparts in Israel. And you see the influence of Christian Zionism today on American politics. It's insane. And just one last point about the boycott. I agree with Rana. It's, short term, of course, it will have negative impact. A lot of people lost their jobs. But also there's, I feel, a drive by Jordanians. We woke up one day and we were like, we don't produce much. You know what I mean? Because we got lazy, I guess. We just imported everything and whatnot. So hopefully in the long term, with the shutting down of a lot of foreign supermarket chains and restaurants and Coca-Cola and Starbucks and whatnot, the hope is that local brands will come in and fill that gap in the market. Now, obviously, they will not be enough to replace what was lost, but I think it will lessen the blow on medium to long term. And that's all I have to say for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Nasser. That's a very sobering prognosis. And there's a lot, again, a lot there that we can unpick, I think, in the discussion. Thank you very much for laying it out in such a way. Curtis, if we can sort of wrap up this part of the presentation with you. Thank you. And I think you're going to speak to sort of international relations, foreign policy, and probably Jordanian US ties too.
Okay. I'll try to be very brief so we can get to as many questions as possible. I do think it's important to put the current crisis in the Jordanian context, and that is that, on the one hand, this is the 25th year of King Abdullah II on the throne, so it should be, the feeling should probably be a little different than it actually is. But the country, as my colleagues have just said, has been going through a whole series of economic crises that predate October 7th by quite a bit. But we're now 9 months into the war. And the other political side of things I think that preceded the current crisis is that Jordan unveiled with another very large commission and large committee a whole set of reforms, modernization, as the committee is referred to, since 2021. But that's actually looming right around the corner, because the idea was to change the party system and the electoral system with elections due in September, which now seems really, really soon, right around the corner. And opposition parties are, for the most part, including the Party of the Muslim Brotherhood, the Islamic Action Front, have declared that they're going to participate. And this is clearly going to be one of the issues in the election, that there is nobody in the country that's not thinking about Gaza. And I think I think Nasser pointed this out, and I want to echo one thing, especially. I think the psychological toll is really important to emphasize, because people follow the news closely, and they don't just follow specific news organizations or outlets. Everybody I know has multiple WhatsApp groups, for their family, for their friends, etc. So they're hearing all kinds of details, and very importantly, they're seeing all kinds of details, especially in terms of shared videos that many news organizations are choosing not to show because they're just too grisly to actually see. So I think the psychological toll is really important to emphasize, that people have been seeing every single day since October 7th, just utterly horrible things. I think most of us are waking up to it every day. People in Jordan have lost family members in Gaza, and by the way, in the West Bank too. So I think we do need to link back to the West Bank, because the fears are about both the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza on the one hand, but also the continuing issues in the West Bank on the other, and fears, as my colleagues also referred to, of mass expulsion of Palestinians and what this would mean for them, what it would mean for Jordan itself. The country itself, as you know, has extensive ties with, well, frankly, very powerful friends, with the United Kingdom, with many, many European countries, with the European Union as a collective, with the United States. But that doesn't mean that its policies and its policy choices are kind of getting through. Jordan has taken really strong, especially for Jordan, these are really, really strong stances to have been calling for a ceasefire every single day since October. For calling for an access to humanitarian aid, and even to some extent participating in that with airdrops and Jordanian field hospitals in Gaza and so on. But Jordan is very well aware that these are very limited, and the context is particularly tough. But it's become, even that has become, really controversial. So I think one of the things we might actually think about then is that something that sort of ties the domestic and the international aspects together for Jordan is the crisis over UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Works Agency for Palestinians. Because on the one hand, Jordan is small enough and the neighborhood is difficult enough that, in my view, Jordanian domestic politics are never 100% domestic, that they're deeply influenced by the external affairs, especially now. And that foreign policy, the other side of that coin, is at least to some extent influenced by domestic pressures. And I think we can agree that all of these, external and internal, are reaching, in terms of pressures, are reaching fever pitch. But the UNRWA crisis, on the one hand, is outside. It affects Palestinians in Gaza, but it also affects more than 2 million registered Palestinian refugees inside Jordan itself, in addition to Palestinian refugees in Lebanon and Syria and so on. So whether that organization is still cut off from the US and other wealthy donor countries affects Palestinians, it affects the Kingdom of Jordan, it affects its politics in many ways. And we've seen protests in the streets that are really been quite intense since October. So in addition to having a politics that's about more conventional participation, elections, parties, going through institutions, we also have a non-institutional politics, which most polls show among Jordanians show most Jordanians think are actually more effective. And that is taking it to the streets, being in demonstrations, protesting, getting your voice heard in a different way. And I think we should look at both angles, the official, what does it mean, elections parties side, and what does it mean for the protests in the street? And really, to what extent are the state and the protesters at loggerheads, or are they actually going in the same direction? And maybe I should stop there.
Thank you, Curtis. Before I start taking questions, are there any other points that all three of you would like to make to one another, picking up any of the issues that you've raised or mentioned? I mean, one of the things that Rana had touched on, and Nasser, I was struck when you said that. I mean, I haven't been to Jordan for a while. There are restaurants where if you're Western or if you're American, or if you're not pro-Palestinian, then you might not be served, or you're unlikely to be served, or you're unwelcome. I mean, I don't think I've ever seen anything like that before in Jordan. This feels very new, very different. That feels like a deep and profound change.
This is new, but we have a saying here in Jordan since October that Gaza had changed us on an individual level, on a collective level. And this is one aspect of it. The anti-Western sentiment has reached the highest level that I can remember in my lifetime, and primarily because the crimes that are being committed right now are being broadcasted live. We wake up on a massacre, we sleep on another massacre, and like Curtis said, Jordan's official stance has been for a ceasefire, and our failure to deliver such a simplistic request, like how complicated is it to stop bombing hospitals and refugee camps and slaughtering people in the tens of thousands, and then the rhetoric coming out of the West, like as if history started on October 7th, and we hear this from a lot of prominent journalists and publications. How the New York Times has reinvented the English language just to try to avoid calling things as they are. And this sort of has created a defiance in Jordanians. We had enough of of your BS, you know what I mean? And even the way that Jordanians are consuming today has changed. We're going more local, we're much more ethical in our behavior, I think. And I don't know what the long-term repercussion of this is going to be, but maybe there will be violence at one point. Maybe a group of kids, not necessarily extremists or anything. They see foreigners, they're like, all right, we bleed, you bleed. You know what I mean? I guess today for most Jordanians, if you want to deal with us as a Western individual or a Western company or a Western entity, you better be pro-Palestinian.
Thank you. We've got a range of questions here, so I'm just going to sort of take a selection one by one. So this is a question from Stephen Andrews. The West Bank appears to have been ignored, with the assumption being made that addressing peace in Gaza will somehow calm the West Bank. Is this a reasonable assumption? If not, what will be the impact of longer-term unrest in the West Bank upon Jordan? I mean, you've kind of touched on that, but perhaps you'd like to sort of tackle that. Who'd like to have a go at that question? Rana, you seem to be nodding. Would you like to bite that one first?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a very fervent, even more extreme kind of movement in the West Bank to expel Palestinians from their land, to confiscate their land, to take as much as possible to make it impossible for any Palestinian future state to exist there. And the problem, as my colleagues also mentioned, is that the government, the current government, which is very right-wing, has the same mentality. And as my colleague Nasser said, is you only have to listen to them if we're talking about Ben Gvir or others talking about taking over the West Bank. So the problem is that the current government, it as I said, it aligns with the same mentality as the settler movement, which is eventually taking over the West Bank. As I said, the consequences are dire, especially for Palestinians, but also for Jordanians. I mean, it's really severe when the king of Jordan, declared that, should such a move of trying to expel Jordanians into Jordan, he called it a declaration of war, because it is really, as my colleagues mentioned, an existential threat to Jordan.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to come back on that? Okay, thank you. I'm going to go to a question here. This is from Dina Mufti, and it's something that probably a lot of us think about. If Donald Trump is elected president, what are the implications for Jordan of a Trump presidency? Curtis, would you like to take a chew at that one?
Technically, no, but I will. I think the implications would be pretty terrible for Jordan and for many others, actually, including for American democracy itself. But in two different ways. One, Trump has made clear, I think he thinks Israel has been restrained in its actions towards Gaza. And while I think we can all agree it has not, nonetheless, I think there would be no even pretense of pushing for a ceasefire or trying to hold back Israel in any way, or having any even attempt at concern for civilian casualties and so on, to the limited extent that that's true anyway. But I just think the situation, it's almost hard to conceive of it being worse, but it would be far worse. And the other way, in addition to what it would mean for Gaza and the West Bank, because I think you can assume Trump would be on board with the Ben Gvirs and Schmotricks of this world in terms of their bigger outlook and maximalist intentions. But the other factor, I think, is that, in the 4 years that Trump was in office, technically speaking, the U.S.-Jordanian relationship just moved along. The aid flows didn't decrease, for example. There were extensive economic and political and intelligence and military and security connections. But nonetheless, for all 4 years, from the grassroots in streets to shops to government offices to the palaces, there was a pervasive sense that Jordan was marginalized and peripheralized and largely forgotten by the U.S. for a 4-year period, after having enjoyed a fairly tight relationship for many, many decades. And there was a sense that that was restored after Trump left office. And I think that was largely true. So I think we would be going back to that. It's just that this time the implications wouldn't just be perhaps from being ignored here. I think the implications might be positively far more deadly and far more dangerous.
Thank you. Rana, Nasser, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, I just wanted to add to Curtis's point, is that, I would call it the special relationship between Trump and MBS, which I believe led to the sidelining of Jordan's role in the region. So we might see that coming back, that this very close relationship with Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia sort of taking on the role of Jordan's role as the negotiator, as the peacemaker, etc. Of course, maybe Curtis as well, is that I think Trump was and is very eager to get the Abraham Accords also back on track. And what would that mean also for Jordan?
Thank you. So I've got a question here. Sorry, I'm just trying. Question for you, Nasser, from Mohammed Haider Ali. It says, you mentioned, this is an existential threat facing Jordan. So is it necessary for Jordan to employ a more interventionist approach, such as by serving as a mediator or pushing more strongly for a ceasefire in the UN?
If I remember correctly, one of the first ceasefire resolutions that were presented to the United Nations was presented through Jordan. And if you listen to the language presented that's being used by our foreign minister, the king and the queen, this is unprecedented. We have never spoken in such strong terms against the Israelis. We've called what they are doing war crimes. We have supported the South African case in the ICJ. But going back to the point I made earlier, we need an alliance to be able to do anything meaningful to try to stop the war. And as I mentioned, and as Rana just noted, the Gulf has their own agenda for the region, and we don't have Iraq of the 1980s that can, dig us out of trouble. Russia is engaged in Ukraine. China doesn't seem to be really interested to have a strong involvement like it does in Africa at the moment. So yes, of course, if you ask most Jordanians, they want a total cutoff with Israel. They want to cancel the peace treaty, any sort of gas or water agreements and whatnot. But my question is, will this be enough? I mean, if you're not listening to the highest court in the world, both highest courts in the world, what would Jordan affect the Israeli political scene? I mean, I doubt that there's much that Jordan can do at this point in time.
Can I just focus for a minute or two on the peace treaty? I mean, a question I get a lot, and I'm sure you all get it a lot, is is it sustainable? Is it durable? I mean, my gut instinct is always to say yes, it's there, it's in place, it's not something that the government can walk away from. It's backed by the US, but I mean, given the strength of feeling on the ground as you've described it, and given where the government, I mean, I don't think the government wants to walk away, but given the strength of the reaction that we've seen, from the king, the queen, prime minister, foreign minister, I mean, this feels unprecedented. I mean, can we work on the assumption that the treaty is going to remain in place?
I mean, whether it remains in place or not is kind of irrelevant, because even our foreign minister, if I can quote him correctly, he said something like, it's just a piece of paper that's collecting dust, because this current government obviously does not want any sort of peace, neither with the Palestinians or any of its neighbors. Since the start of this war, they've hit targets in Iran, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Syria, Gaza, West Bank. And as I said before, most Jordanians, it's only a matter of time before they do something here. I think maybe the state can use this as a last resort when, in terms of negotiation with its allies in Europe and the States, because the peace treaty has always been touted as a success of American diplomacy and influence on the region and whatnot. But the problem is that most Jordanians, and I think most analysts would agree, that the Americans are not honest brokers. Like yesterday, Blinken in Amman pledged $400 million for humanitarian assistance in Gaza. This is after 100 and some billion dollars in assistance to the Israeli aggression against the Palestinians in terms of military equipment and whatnot. Maybe we need different brokers. Maybe China would want to come in and do a different role. It did, with Iran and Saudi Arabia a couple of years back, or I think earlier last year, they kind of negotiated the reapproachment between them. But if you ask most Jordanians today, they don't want anything to do with that peace treaty because the Israelis are not serious about it. I don't want to take too much of your time. I'm just going to mention something like back in the day when the peace treaty was signed, there was genuine hope among Jordanians and Palestinians that we can maybe, have some sort of understanding where Palestinian state is established, the Israeli security is guaranteed and whatnot. But over the last 30 years, this has been totally eroded.
Thank you. Yes, Rana, and then we'll take Curtis. Thank you. I think you're on mute, Rana.
Sorry, I just have two short points. The first is I was in Germany recently, and I just posed this question up, and I'll pose it to you and Curtis. If there is an expulsion of Palestinians into Jordan from the West Bank, and if let's say a scenario where the king feels that it is in a way a declaration of war, and he's facing internal and external pressure. In this case, who will stand with Jordan? Who will stand with Jordan against Israel? And no one had an answer. I don't know if you have an answer, but I mean, it's something to really think about. We tend to think of our allies as the US, France, UK, all of these as very close allies. But I'm trying to build a scenario of when push comes to shove, when they are put in this situation with this current Israeli government and the settler movement. I really wonder who will stand with Jordan.
Curtis, do you dare answer that question?
Yeah, I was hoping for softball questions, Neil, but I keep getting the hard ones. I don't have a great answer, and I'm glad you asked the question, Rana, because it's a really important, and it is, to use the term that Nasser used earlier, it's an existential question for Jordan. And I think that's the difference now. I think that's why we're feeling such a different tone. Jordan has been through a lot over the years. Neil, you set up this whole thing at the beginning with noting all the different times that there have been regional crises that really pushed the kingdom in many ways, and its population. This strikes me as crossing a whole other set of lines. I do think Jordan would get extensive support, except it would be a bit late in terms of humanitarian disaster. I'm not sure they would get a lot of, I'm not sure what it would even mean in terms of who would stand with them in terms of if it turns into actual war footing. So I actually wanted to link it back to your peace treaty comment in this way, and the fact that there's this revived massive set of protest movements that have been across Jordan from October onward, and they've kind of gone up and down over the months, depending on what's actually happening, at least weekly, but if not, more, and actually pushing the boundaries a little further than usual. And I mean that in the sense of protesters literally physically going further and getting as close as they can get to the Israeli embassy, for example, and changing what the chants are actually about. And the tolerance of the state has changed depending on what lines you actually cross there and whatnot. But I wanted to emphasize one thing, and that is, well, it's clear that people are agitated enough to be out in the streets. One, this is a really broad and diverse movement. It includes Islamist movements, as one would expect, like the Brotherhood and the Islamic Action Front and their various auxiliaries. It includes lots of left-leaning political parties and pan-Arab nationalists. It includes tons of people of no party affiliation whatsoever who are ordinary citizens. It includes people from the Iraq movements that we've seen from 2011 onward. It's broad, it's eclectic. It's been a bit more creative, honestly, than a lot of movements in the past. And to some extent, though, as both Nasser and Rana pointed out, the state itself has been stronger in its use of language than we've ever seen. I mean, joining the case accusing Israel of genocide that South Africa brought to the International Court of Justice, supporting the International Criminal Court cases against specific ministers, using the word genocide, using the words war crimes at the highest levels of the state. There are times when the highest levels of the state actually sound exactly like what people in the streets are protesting. So there's one area where I think they start to split a little bit, and that is protesters are, on board with all of those things, except they want to go a little bit further, and maybe more than a little bit. And many of the things they're chanting for are canceling the Wadi Araba Treaty, the Israeli-Jordanian peace treaty, canceling the gas agreement with Israel, which was also unpopular. And so, as usual, this is almost bizarre to me, but Benjamin Netanyahu has this uncanny ability to unite the Jordanian opposition. It's like his only actual skill. So this broad coalition has been mobilized in mutual detestation of what is actually going on. And they're just trying to push the state a little bit further. They would like to see the treaty canceled. They want to get to the border. They want to kill what they see as the land bridge of aid that gets into Israel. They want more aid to Gaza, but they're worried that they're actually unwittingly supporting Israel's war effort, and they want that to end. And they're calling very much into question Jordan's relations with the United States, specifically its military agreements. And so to go back to Rana's question as well, that's one of the wild cards, that the state sees the U.S. military presence, because there is an agreement for that, as supporting Jordanian national security, whereas a lot of the protesters in the street see the U.S. military presence as a direct here and now, clear and present danger to Jordanian national security. And they're thinking of it in that what if scenario. What if something really goes wrong? Whose side are they actually on? Are they there to defend Jordan, or are they there for the neighbor to the west, and are they actually supporting Israel and the expulsion fear? And we can't answer that question, but I do think it's really important to get that in some ways, protest movement in the state are actually on the same page, more than we've seen in the past. But on these important issues, that's where we see clear divergence between the two.
Thank you, Curtis. I just want to change tack a little bit. We've had a couple of questions about Hamas. I have a question here from Russia, Akash. What is your assessment of Hamas growing popularity in Jordan? Who'd like to take that one? Thank you, Nasser.
It's interesting. Like if you go back to October 6th, Hamas was, I don't want to say it enjoyed a huge popularity in Jordan. But what's interesting today is that the support that it gets is not from Muslims only. It's not from people that align themselves with the political Islam. You have a lot of liberals, you have a lot of leftists, you have a lot of Jordanians from tribal backgrounds, Palestinian backgrounds that are hugely supportive of Hamas. There's many reasons for that, but primarily because we view them as the first defense line right now. Because if Israel succeeds in Gaza, as I said before, most Jordanians are convinced that they will be eventually next. Also, tying this into the war situation, if it happens, Rana asked who will stand by Jordan. I don't think anybody will stand by Jordan, but Jordanians realize that, and Jordanian today, because of they feel this existential threat, simply answer this question by, well, it's going to happen, it's going to happen. So we might as well fight this war. I mean, we're not very optimistic that we'll win it, but at least we'll get it over and done with. And for a majority of people that I speak to, and especially among the youth, they want martyrdom defending the country, because they don't see any other scenario unless this entity on the West Bank is dismantled, which we'll know will take decades to do. They look at this as something that's inevitable. We will go to war with them one day. And Hamas popularity right now is enormous, and it's pushing that narrative among Jordanians that, you know, a bunch of guys in flip-flops and simple machine guns have withstood 9 months of atrocities. Why are we any different, or why are we any better to think that we will not suffer the same consequence? And this again, the support for Hamas is despite the ideological differences from leftists and secularists and liberals and whatnot. People have no problem showing support. You can see the triangle and other symbols associated with Hamas all over the country.
Thank you. I just want to pick a quick question that came in, and it almost flips your question about allies or dependability or who's going to stand. The question is, is it time for Jordan to have new allies? I mean, I don't know how you answer that necessarily, but given what you've just said, Nasser, given where the population is, are there other alternative allies out there that are sort of being considered?
To fill in the gap of the Western powers that have good relations with Jordan, I really don't see it unless somehow maybe the BRICS countries get together, they become more active. Maybe if China takes a more direct role in the Middle East, something along these lines, because the Arab states is a hopeless case. Most of them have their own problems. And the others that don't have the problems and actually have the power, they have a totally different agenda that go against the interests of Jordan. And this is, I think, that's leading to the despair that I was talking about just a minute earlier, where Jordanians are like, it's inevitable that the Israelis will come for us, so we might as well. This is because we can't see any sort of solution on the horizon, specifically now with the return of Trump, or the possible return of Trump, and the European elections. I mean, we saw what happened 2 days ago with the rise of the far right in Europe and other countries. So if there's anybody out there that can suggest allies, please do.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you, Kurtz.
To play on that, I don't have a great solution to this except to say this, that I do think there's been a pervasive sense, and including before October, of Jordanians getting frustrated over the last several years, actually, with this, and openly calling for Jordan to sort of diversify who its foreign relations are with, getting frustrated with the Western states in particular. But Jordan in recent years, in the last several years, has gotten closer to quite a few of the Gulf states, which are vital to its ability to send workers overseas who send remittances back to Jordan. It's been important for Jordan's energy needs and definitely for foreign investment and things like that. It's gotten very much closer, especially in a whole series of energy agreements with Egypt and Iraq. But this is, to me, this is kind of the depressing part. This is not a country that is marginalized and excluded, or is itself subject to various and sundry boycotts, even on the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council. Jordan is a huge recipient of American foreign aid. It has tight relations with the United Kingdom. It has close relations with France. It maintains very cordial relations with Russia, very workable relations with China. That's all 5 of the big 5. It's seen as a sort of poster country for UN peacekeeping operations worldwide in terms of being a global good citizen, etc. But that's why I'm saying it's frustrating. Jordan has a foreign policy that's kind of based on alienating nobody and maintaining bridges. And I think the frustration is, and look how ineffective this is. It's not that Jordan should change its course necessarily, but as Nasser was referring to earlier, the frustrating part, I think, is how can you have such strong, powerful allies, even though allies who don't even like each other, but they like you, and regionally, internationally, institutionally, and yet it doesn't seem to change the situation on the ground. There are just limits to what Jordan can do. I think it's doing what it can do internationally. I can't even think of what else to put on the list at this point. And that, to me, is the biggest frustration point, that it's, in the end, not changing the situation.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got time for one more question, and this is from Peter Millett, who is a former British ambassador to Jordan. He asks, how damaging are the regular violations of the status quo relating to the Haram al-Sharif in Jerusalem by Jewish extremists to the reputation of Jordan and Hashemites as the custodians of the holy sites? Who wants to take that one?
Rana, do you want to go? I answered that. Okay, it's a huge contention point, because it's a point of that the streets protesters use a lot. The state has always justified sort of the peace treaty that, okay, at least we get the guarantee of custodianship on the religious sites over in Jerusalem in particular. Yet we see violations almost every weekend or every week by Israeli settlers and extremists over there. and it's damaging the regime. The regime has a lot of it has some religious legitimacy in Jordan and in Jerusalem in particular. And people are questioning what custodianship are we talking about when Israeli settlers can casually storm the mosque and other religious sites, and nothing ever happens from the Jordanian side except condemnation and whatnot. And for a lot of people, especially religious people, this holds a lot of significance. Jerusalem, the mosque in Jerusalem holds a very high place in Muslim ideology. And even the operation by Hamas on October 7th was called the Tawfan al-Aqsa, which refers to the mosque. So it's having a huge impact, and it's making people question why do we have that peace treaty, and it's a strong attacking point against the regime and the government at the moment.
Thank you. Time is up. I mean, that went very, very quickly. Rana, Nasser, Curtis, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your interventions, your comments, and your insights. I mean, I sort of framed this at the beginning, that Jordan has these external shocks and has just gone through a series of external shocks. But I think, I mean, the overwhelming piece that's come out from this conversation is that, this is new territory. A threshold seems to have been passed. It's not just one of those things that's going to pass by or can simply be muddled through. I mean, Jordan is really clearly feeling, the impacts of the Gaza war massively, and shifts and changes in the region, as you've highlighted. The role of the Gulf. We didn't even get onto Iran. Is really just changing that dynamic, and the prospect of a Trump presidency as well just doesn't bode well. I'm sorry to leave on a very sobering, on a very serious note, but that seems to be where we've landed today. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you to all of our audience for joining this afternoon. Very much look forward to speaking to you again at our next webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.